She stood in the center of a room full of men who had spent 40 years managing this estate, pointed to a number on a ledger that none of them wanted to acknowledge, and said, "This plan will not work." The silence that followed was the particular silence of people deciding whether to be offended or frightened. Lord Edmund Wycliffe, Duke of Ashbourne, looked at the woman. Everyone in the county called an inconvenience, and asked for the first time in 11 years of running this estate, a question he did not already know the answer to. Before we begin, subscribe to the Duke's Diary and stay until the end of this story. Tell me which city you are watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. The morning Lord Edmund Wycliffe returned to Ashbourne Estate after 6 weeks in London. The sky above Yorkshire was the particular grey of a sky that has made up its mind about the weather and is simply waiting for the appropriate moment to confirm it. The carriage came through the gates at 8:30, and by 9 o'clock Edmund was already at his desk. This was not unusual. Edmund Wycliffe had been returning to Ashbourne and immediately sitting at his desk since he was 19 years old, when his brother had died, and the estate had passed to him between one season and the next, like a gift that was also a weight. He had learned to carry the weight the way his father had taught him, without complaint, without delay, without permitting himself the indulgence of wondering whether he was tired. He was, in fact, frequently tired. He did not permit himself to think about this. The desk was covered in correspondence that had accumulated during his absence. Tenancy matters estate, accounts a letter from his solicitor in London, 3 letters from neighboring families that he suspected contained invitations he would decline, and a note from his estate manager Mr. Hargrove, indicating that the quarterly review council had been arranged for 11 o'clock that morning as requested. Edmund read through the correspondence with the efficiency of a man who had done exactly this, in exactly this chair, on exactly this kind of grey Yorkshire morning, for 17 years. He made decisions in the margins. He wrote responses in his precise, compressed hand. He worked through the pile with a thoroughness that left nothing unaddressed. When Mr. Hargrove appeared at 10 minutes to 11 to confirm the council was assembled, Edmund had already finished the correspondence and moved on to the estate accounts. "They are waiting in the East Room, Your Grace," Hargrove said. He was a solid, competent man of 55, who had managed the practical operations of Ashbourne for the past 12 years, with the specific loyalty of someone who genuinely believed in the institution he served. He had seen Edmund at 19 overwhelmed and determined not to show it. He had watched him become the man he now was. He was also occasionally the only person in Edmund's immediate circle who told him something he did not want to hear, and even Hargrove had limits. "Is everyone present?" Edmund asked without looking up from the accounts. "Yes, Your Grace. All 5 advisors. Mr. Croft from the Tenant Committee." A brief pause. "And Miss Whitmore." Edmund looked up. "Miss Whitmore," he repeated. "Yes, Your Grace. She was invited by Mr. Croft, as you'll recall. You approved the addition to the council when you were last in residence. She has been reviewing the northern farming records for the past 3 weeks. Edmund did not recall approving this addition, which meant he had approved it during a period when the volume of decisions passing across his desk was such that some of them passed through without the attention they perhaps deserved. He felt a brief, familiar irritation, not at the decision itself, but at the evidence that he was sometimes moving too quickly through things that warranted more consideration. "Miss Whitmore," he said again. "Remind me. Daughter of the late Mr. George Whitmore, who managed the Harton estate for 30 years before his death, 4 years ago. She came to Ashbourne when Mr. Croft was struggling to reconcile the northern tenant accounts. She apparently has some facility with estate records and farming management. She identified several errors in the tenancy calculations and corrected them without being asked." Hargrove's expression remained entirely neutral, which in Edmund's experience meant the man was privately entertained by something. "Mr. Croft finds her useful." "And what does she find herself?" "I believe, Your Grace, that she finds herself correct," Hargrove said. "Quite frequently." Edmund looked at him for a moment. Then he set down his pen. 11 o'clock, he said. The East Room at Ashbourne was a long, well-proportioned room that had been used for estate council meetings for 3 generations of Wycliffes. It had the particular quality of a room that has witnessed a great deal of careful, serious decision-making. The furniture was good, but not elaborate. The fireplace, large and functional. The long table designed for documents and maps, rather than for entertaining. Portraits of two previous dukes hung on the east wall, both of them wearing expressions that communicated a similar message. This family has always taken its responsibilities seriously. Edmund entered at precisely 11 o'clock and took his place at the head of the table. The 5 advisors. Hargrove old Mr. Fenn, who managed the estate finances. Mr. Aldridge, who handled the legal matters, and 2 younger men named Croft and Pemberton, who managed the tenant relations and agricultural oversight respectively, arranged themselves as they always did. Hargrove to his right, the others in their established positions around the table. At the far end of the table, which was technically the position least calculated to draw attention, sat a woman who was nonetheless managing to draw some of it simply by reason of her presence, which was the sort of composed, quiet presence that tends to be noticed precisely because it is not attempting to be. Edmund observed her as he took his seat. Miss Eleanor Whitmore was perhaps 27, simply dressed in a dark green that was not fashionable but was well chosen for a Yorkshire morning, with chestnut hair, arranged practically rather than elaborately, and an expression that he classified in the brief moment of first impression as watchful. Not anxious. Watchful. There was a difference. Anxious people watched rooms to assess their danger. This woman watched the room the way a person watches a problem they are still in the process of understanding. She had a notebook in front of her open with several pages of close handwriting. She did not look at Edmund when he entered. She was reading her own notes. He found this he recognized immediately interesting. "Gentlemen," he said, and after a brief pause, "Miss Whitmore." She looked up then directly with the expression of someone who had been waiting to be acknowledged and was moderately unsurprised that it had taken this long. "Your Grace." He held the look for a moment, then turned to the General Assembly. "We will begin with the northern farming situation, as that appears to be the most immediate matter. Mr. Pemberton, your report." Pemberton, a competent young man of 30, who had grown up on the estate and knew the land well, presented his agricultural analysis with the thorough, slightly anxious efficiency of someone performing in front of a difficult examiner. The northern section of Ashbourne's farmland had seen declining yields for 3 consecutive seasons. The proposed solution, which Edmund had reviewed in broad terms before leaving for London, involved a significant restructuring of the tenancy arrangements, consolidating several smaller holdings into larger units, reducing the overall number of tenant families, and redirecting the land toward more commercially productive use. The numbers were sound. Edmund had reviewed them twice. The projections showed a clear improvement in yield and revenue within 2 seasons. He listened to Pemberton present them with the attention he brought to everything, full, specific, absorbing the detail, rather than simply the conclusion. And when the presentation ended, he began to speak. He had said exactly 1 sentence when Miss Whitmore said, "This plan will not work." The room became very still. Edmund stopped speaking. He looked at her. She was not looking at him with defiance exactly. She was looking at him with the expression of someone who has identified a problem and is waiting to see whether the people around the table are going to address it or pretend it isn't there. Old Mr. Fenn made a small sound of protest. Aldridge looked at the ceiling. Pemberton, who had spent 3 weeks preparing his report, appeared to be undergoing some private difficulty. Edmund said evenly, "Then what would you do differently?" The silence that followed this question was of a different quality than the silence that had followed her statement. That silence had been the silence of a room waiting for a reprimand. This one was the silence of a room that had just recalibrated. She appeared, he noted, entirely unsurprised by the question, as though she had anticipated that it would be asked, had prepared for it, and was ready. "3 things," she said. She did not check her notes. She had already done that. First, the consolidation of the northern tenancies assumes that larger units are more efficient, which is true in certain soil conditions and not true in others. The northern section of Ashbourne's land has a clay composition in the lower fields that drains badly. Larger operations require drainage investment that your current numbers do not account for. Without it, the larger holdings will perform worse than the smaller ones they replaced. Edmund had not been told about the clay composition. He looked at Pemberton, who had the expression of a man confirming information he had hoped would not be raised. Second, Miss Whitmore continued, the reduction in tenant families removes 23 households from Ashbourne. Those families do not disappear when you remove them from your records. They become the problem of the village, or of the county, or of someone else's estate. The village economy is closely connected to Ashbourne's. Your reduced tenancy will reduce the trade that supports the market, which will reduce the income of the village tradespeople, which will reduce their ability to pay for services and goods connected back to Ashbourne. The circular effect over 2 seasons will offset approximately a third of your projected revenue improvement. Mr. Fenn had stopped making sounds of protest. He appeared to be doing calculations in his head. Third, she said, the proposal was made by people who understand the numbers and not the land. The farmers who have been working the northern section for 20 and 30 years know things about that soil that your surveys have not captured. They haven't been asked. She stopped. The room was very quiet. Edmund looked at the woman at the far end of the table and thought several things in rapid succession. He thought she is right about the drainage almost certainly. He thought the circular economic argument is sound, and I should have thought of it myself, and the fact that I did not is because I have been thinking of the tenant reduction as a revenue problem rather than a community problem. He thought, she has been here for 3 weeks, and she has learned something that 11 years of estate management have not surfaced. I thought last, she is looking at me exactly the way I look at problems I am in the process of solving, which is to say, she is looking at me as a problem she has not yet determined the solution to. This was in his extensive social experience, entirely unusual. You have reviewed the northern accounts for 3 weeks, he said. Yes. You have not reviewed the drainage surveys. No. But Mr. Croft showed me the field maps, and the elevation data suggests the drainage issue clearly. I could be wrong about the specific composition, but I am not wrong about the elevation. And the circular economic argument. Where did that come from? She paused only briefly. My father managed the Harton estate for 30 years. When I was 15, the Harton family proposed a similar consolidation. He showed me on paper why it would reduce the estate's actual income, even while improving its apparent accounts. They did not listen to him. 3 years later, the Harton market was struggling, and they brought in an outside consultant who told them essentially what my father had said. I have been watching for the same error since. Edmund looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation strictly required. He turned to Hargrove. We will table the northern proposal. I want a proper drainage survey of the lower fields commissioned someone this week, not the same surveyor who produced the existing report. I want a separate analysis of the circular economic effects on the village. And I want, he looked at Miss Whitmore. The farmers who have worked the northern land for 20 or more years consulted before any proposal goes forward. Your Grace, Hargrove said, in the tone of someone filing this against all established precedent, yes. The remainder of the agenda, Edmund said, and moved forward. He found her afterward in the corridor. This was not entirely accidental. He had closed the meeting and allowed the others to file out and then moved through the east wing with the direction of someone who has a specific destination in mind and is constructing the appearance of incidental movement. He had not decided exactly to seek her out. He had decided not to let the opportunity close without taking it. She was standing near the window at the end of the corridor, looking out at the gray morning and writing in her notebook. She had her coat on already, which meant she had not expected another conversation. Miss Whitmore, she turned. Your Grace. He stopped beside her at the appropriate distance and looked at the same window she had been looking at. The estate grounds were visible from here. The formal garden, which was well maintained, and beyond it, the beginning of the working land, which was functional but not flourishing. You knew those arguments would not be received well, he said, when you made them. Yes. And yet you made them. Someone should have, she said simply. He considered this. Most people who attend an estate council for the first time make their point more carefully. They suggest rather than state. They qualify. They invite agreement before they invite disagreement. Most people come to council meetings hoping to be retained, she said. I came to council to be useful. Those are different objectives. And if I had dismissed you after your first statement? She looked at him directly. Then the drainage problem would still exist, and the tenant families would still be removed, and the village market would still contract, and the estate accounts would look improved for 18 months before the actual situation became impossible to ignore. A pause. Whether I was retained would not change any of those facts. Edmund was quiet for a moment. In 11 years of estate management, he had employed a great many advisors and consultants and specialists. Some of them were excellent at their work. Some of them were adequate. All of them shared a common quality. They told him things in the way that people tell things to a man who holds their continued employment in his hands. They calibrated their honesty to his reception. This woman had not done that. I was not entirely sure what to do with it. He found somewhat to his own surprise that he was interested rather than irritated. "The drainage survey," he said. "You said you could be wrong about the composition." "I could be. I said the elevation suggests it, not that I have verified it." "Would you like to verify it?" She looked at him with the same direct, slightly assessing gaze she had used at the table. "I am not a drainage surveyor." "No, but you read the field maps. You identified the question when 3 qualified advisors had not asked it. I would find it useful to have someone ask those questions alongside the surveyor rather than after him." He paused. "If you are interested." Miss Eleanor Whitmore looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone determining whether an offer is what it appears to be or something more complicated. Then she said, "I would need access to the full Northern Section records, not just the summaries Mr. Pemberton was working from." "You will have them." She nodded once. "Then yes." He moved to go. Then, because he was a man who was always precise about the things that needed to be said, and frequently imprecise about the things that did not, "You were right this morning, about all 3 points." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. He walked back through the corridor of Ashbourne Manor, with the faint, unfamiliar sensation of a man who has just had a conversation that has left him with more questions than he arrived with. It was not, he realized, a disagreeable feeling. He could not immediately explain why. The northern fields in late October were a particular kind of beautiful that had nothing to do with pleasantness. The sky was the color of cold pewter. The hedgerows were stripped to their bones. The fields themselves were dark with the season the earth turned and waiting. There was a smell of coming rain and old leaves, and the specific coolness of air that is working up to something decisive. Miss Whitmore walked ahead of Edmund and Mr. Sutton, the drainage surveyor, and pointed at things. This was Edmund had discovered in the 40 minutes since they had left the estate carriages at the edge of the northern track her method. She walked slightly ahead of the group, not aggressively, but persistently, and when she identified something she wanted to discuss, she stopped and pointed at it and waited to be addressed. She did not defer. She did not perform uncertainty. She did not feel. She asked specific questions of Sutton, and listened to the answers with an attention that visibly disconcerted the surveyor, who was accustomed to clients who asked general questions and accepted general answers. "Here," she said, stopping at the edge of the lower field. Edmund and Sutton caught up with her. She was looking at a section where the ground had a slightly different texture, darker, with a particular density that was visible even to a non-expert eye once she had directed attention to it. "You see the surface here," she said to Sutton. "This is the area I mentioned from the elevation maps. What does that tell you?" Sutton crouched and pressed the soil. His expression changed. "Heavy clay," he said. "Very heavy." He looked up. The elevation data was right. This section has been draining into the lower field for years. The surface looks manageable in dry months, but in wet. "The winter yields have been lower here for 3 consecutive seasons," Miss Whitmore said. "Mr. Croft's records show it clearly. Everyone assumed it was a rotation problem." "It is a drainage problem," Sutton said. He stood and looked at the field with the expression of someone recalibrating a significant professional assumption. "It is not unfixable, but the cost of the drainage work needed here would require a full revision of the consolidation budget." "Yes," she said. She did not say "I told you so." She did not need to. Edmund had been listening in silence. He spent most of his time in the field in silence when he was accompanied by people who knew more than he did about the specific subject at hand. He had learned this approach at 19, when he had made the mistake of talking during a survey, and discovered that he was spending the time in which he should have been learning to confirm his own existing positions. He watched Miss Whitmore, and he listened to Sutton, and he thought about the distance between what the accounts had shown and what the field was showing now. He was thinking about this when he became aware that she had stopped walking and was looking at something to the left away from the survey area entirely. He followed her gaze. At the edge of the field, where the Ashbourne land met the beginning of the old woodland, a group of workers were stopping for their midday meal. They were farmhands from the northern section, the same men whose tenancy arrangements were under review, whose future on Ashbourne's land was currently an entry in a financial projection. They sat together with the ease of men who had sat together through many seasons of the same. He watched her watch them. "You grew up on an estate," he said, not quite as a question. "Yes. My father believed that understanding the estate meant understanding the people on it." She paused. He would come home from a tenant visit and tell me about the family he had spoken to. Not just the farming situation. The family. He thought the human detail was the relevant information. Most estate managers would disagree. "Most estate managers are wrong," she said with a directness that she did not soften, and he was beginning to understand she was not going to soften. Then, with something that might have been the faintest admission, "He was a very good manager. He deserved better recognition than he received." Edmund looked at her profile. She was still watching the workers at the edge of the field. Her expression had the particular quality he had noticed at the council table, contained precise, but with something beneath it that was not contained, something that was doing its own work underneath the surface. "What happened to his recognition?" he asked. She turned to look at him, slightly surprised by the question. Then she settled into answering it. "He managed the Harton estate for 30 years and improved it significantly. When Lord Harton died, the estate passed to his nephew, who brought in his own people. My father's record was accurate but uncelebrated." She looked back at the field. "He did not complain about it. He said the work was the thing, not the credit for it. I believed him at the time. And now I think he deserved both," she said. "The work was the thing, but so was the credit." Edmund considered this for a moment. He thought about his own father's instruction. A Wycliffe does not complain. A Wycliffe carries the burden, and about how he had absorbed that instruction so completely that he had never examined whether it was true. He thought it was perhaps worth examining. "The workers," he said. "The ones whose tenancy arrangements are being reviewed. Have they been told?" "No. Mr. Croft has been waiting for the council's decision before speaking to them." She paused. "They know something is happening. Workers always know." "What are they likely to think?" She looked at him. "That their families are going to be moved off land their grandfathers farmed. That no one is going to tell them why until after the decision has been made." She paused. "That they do not matter to the people who own the land they work." Edmund was quiet for a moment. He had known in the abstract way that one knows things one has not fully examined, that the consolidation plan affected people. He had thought about them as a factor, the dislocation cost, the social welfare consideration, the reputational element. He had not thought about a man sitting at the edge of a field with his work companions, not knowing whether he would be there next season. He thought about the difference between those two ways of knowing. I thought about a woman who had watched her father go uncelebrated for 30 years and had decided that she would say the accurate thing, even in rooms that did not want to hear it. "We will speak to them before any decision is finalized," he said. Not to Sutton, who was crouching over the clay soil again and making notes, but to her. She looked at him. "The farmers who have worked the northern land for 20 or more years," he said. "You said they haven't been asked. I intend to ask them." She held his gaze for a moment with the same assessing quality she had brought to every exchange between them, the quality of someone determining whether an offer is real. "Yes," she said finally. "That would be the right thing to do." They stood at the edge of the northern field in the cold October air, and the workers at the woodland's edge continued their meal, and Sutton made his notes, and the sky continued to accumulate its intention. Edmund looked at the land that had been in his family for 3 generations, and thought about the difference between managing something and understanding it. He had spent 17 years becoming excellent at the former. I was beginning to wonder whether he had neglected the latter. He looked at the woman standing beside him with her notebook and her direct gaze, and her ability to identify what rooms did not want to hear, and he thought she understands things. I have not asked the right questions about yet. He wanted to ask more of them. That evening, working alone in his study with the accounts and the revised notes from Sutton's initial assessment, Edmund found himself doing something that was not strictly speaking part of the estate management process. He was thinking about a conversation. He did not, as a rule, think about conversations after they had ended. He was a man who made decisions, implemented them, moved forward. He did not ruminate. He had trained himself out of rumination at 19, because rumination was a form of self-indulgence that left the estate's problems unaddressed while he sat with his feelings about them. But he found himself returning with the specific quality of attention he brought to things that had not yet resolved themselves into clear understanding to several moments from the afternoon. The way she had walked ahead on the northern track, not aggressively, but persistently. The way she had said he was right about all 3 points before he had said it himself. The way she had looked at the workers at the edge of the field, not with pity, which he would have expected, but with recognition. With the specific quality of recognition that belongs to people who have seen from another angle what it costs to have your work go unacknowledged. She was not performing compassion. She was not trying to show him something for strategic purpose. She was simply looking in the way that people look when they see something that is true and do not know how to pass over it without acknowledging it. Edmund looked at the accounts in front of him. He had spent 17 years being a man who did not permit himself to need things he could not reliably supply for himself. He was self-sufficient in the way of people who have learned that other things disappear. His brother had disappeared. His childhood had disappeared between one season and the next, replaced by weight he had not been fully ready for. He had decided, not quite consciously, that the safest policy was to need as little as possible from sources beyond his own control. He did not think this sitting at his desk in the October evening. He simply found himself thinking about a conversation that had not resolved into clear understanding. He found himself noting that a woman had told him things his advisors had not told him. Not because she was competing with them, but because she saw things they did not. He found himself thinking, I want to know what else she sees. He set down his pen. He looked out the window at the dark estate. Tomorrow. He thought there were 3 tenant families in the northern section he had never spoken to directly. He would speak to them. He would bring Miss Whitmore. He was not, he told himself, thinking about her specifically. I was thinking about the approach she had described. His father's approach, really repurposed by a woman who had grown up watching it work. He was thinking about the value of the human detail as relevant information. He was not entirely convincing himself. He picked up his pen and went back to work. Outside, the November rain that the sky had been accumulating its intention toward began to fall on Ashbourne's fields, on the good land, and the clay-heavy land on the formal gardens, and the workers' cottages on the east wing, and the old woodland at the estate's edge. The estate was large and old, and full of things Edmund Wycliffe had spent 17 years learning to manage. Howe was beginning to understand that management was not the only thing it required. The first tenant he spoke to was a man named Gareth Hollis, whose family had farmed the northern section's lower fields for 32 years. Howe was 51, with the permanent outdoor weathering of men who spend their lives in the fields regardless of the season, and the particular wariness of someone who has been waiting to receive news he suspects will not be good. He met them, Edmund and Miss Whitmore and Mr. Croft, at the gate of his farm with his hat in his hands and the expression of someone performing composure. Edmund had, in the hours since deciding to do this, considered how to begin. He had considered several approaches. When they arrived and Hollis stood there with his hat in his hands, Edmund found that none of the approaches he had considered were the right ones. He said simply, "Tell me about this land. What do you know about it that the estate surveys don't?" Hollis looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man determining whether the question was genuine. He had a great deal to say. He talked for 40 minutes. He talked about the lower fields drainage, which he had been managing around for 20 years, with specific planting choices that the surveys had never captured because they had never asked. He talked about a section of the upper north where a seasonal stream made the ground unpredictably wet in spring, and how he had developed a rotation that accounted for this, in ways that looked counterintuitive in the records, but produced consistent yields. He talked about 3 other families on the northern section who had similar accumulated knowledge of their specific land. Edmund listened. He asked specific questions. He did not tell Hollis about the consolidation plan. At the end of the conversation, standing at the gate, Hollis looked at Edmund with a slightly different expression than he had worn at the beginning. "Your Grace," he said, "I've been here 32 years, and no one from the house has come to ask me about the land." "I know," Edmund said. "That's—" Hollis stopped. "I'm glad you asked," he said. They walked back to the carriage. Miss Whitmore said nothing for some time. Then, "He knows things about that lower section that would have taken a drainage engineer months and significant cost to discover. And he's been sitting on them because no one thought to knock on his gate." "Yes," Edmund said. She looked at him with the assessment quality, and whatever she found, she did not speak it aloud. He had the sense nonetheless that she had found something that surprised her. He found this. He examined the feeling for a moment, turning it over, the way he turned over problems that had not yet resolved themselves into clear understanding. He found it mattered to him, more than he had expected. November at Ashbourne arrived with the specific conviction of a Yorkshire November that intends to be taken seriously. The gardens went brown, and the mornings came late, and the house settled into the particular rhythm of a large property, preparing for winter fires built earlier. Certain rooms closed to conserve warmth. The estate business shifting inward from the fields to the account books and the correspondence, and the quiet concentrated work of planning for the season to come. Eleanor Whitmore became part of this rhythm without either of them remarking upon it. She had arrived at Ashbourne in October as a temporary consultant, her engagement defined by the Northern Section Review. By the middle of November, she was working in the estate office every morning, reviewing the accumulated correspondence about tenant matters, cross-referencing it against the farming records, building the kind of comprehensive picture of Ashbourne's operations that no one had apparently attempted to construct before, because it required simultaneously understanding the financial records and the agricultural reality and the human situation of the families involved, and the estate had never previously employed anyone who was equally comfortable in all 3 areas. Edmund was aware of this. He was aware of it with the specific attention he brought to things that were unexpectedly useful. The quality of interest he felt when a piece of information solved a problem he had not known needed solving. He told himself this was what it was. Interest in her usefulness. Attention to a resource that had proved valuable. He did not entirely convince himself. It was Hargrove who first said anything, and he said it obliquely, in the way Hargrove said everything that required some care. "Miss Whitmore has completed the Northern account summary," he said one morning, setting the document on Edmund's desk. "She left notes at the relevant points where she believes the council should consider alternatives to the original proposal." "Yes," Edmund said, pulling the document toward him. "She's also been talking to the workers' families in the village. On her own time, I should mention, not as part of any assigned task. She brought Mrs. Hollis into the estate office last week to discuss the education arrangements for the Hollis children." Edmund looked up. Education arrangements. The Northern consolidation, if it had proceeded as planned, would have moved 3 families away from the village school. 2 of those families have children enrolled. Miss Whitmore has been quietly establishing what the impact would have been and what alternative arrangements might have served them better. Hargrove's tone remained entirely neutral. "She did not bring it to you because she did not feel it was her place to expand her brief without being asked. I thought you should know, in case you felt it was relevant." Edmund was quiet for a moment. He picked up the document and looked at the neat columns, the clear annotations, the specific careful detail of someone who had gone considerably beyond the original assignment without requiring recognition for having done so. He thought about his father's instruction again. He thought about a woman who had watched her father spend 30 years going uncelebrated and had decided that the work was still worth doing. He did not this time set the thought aside. The library at Ashbourne was on the 2nd floor in the east wing, positioned for morning light in a way that suggested the person who had designed the room had understood exactly what a library was for. Floor-to-ceiling shelves. Good reading chairs positioned near the windows. A desk in the corner. The kind of room that had been built with love and maintained with discipline and quietly neglected by someone who had too many other things that required his attention. Edmund used it rarely. He read in his study in the spare minutes of the day, practically rather than expansively. He read for information and occasionally for relief from information. He did not spend afternoons in the library the way the room seemed to have been designed for. He came in one Tuesday afternoon in mid-November to retrieve a specific property reference and found Eleanor Whitmore there. She was in the chair nearest the window, with 3 books open on the small table beside her and a 4th in her hands, and she was doing what people who are very comfortable in libraries do, reading and referring and cross-referencing with the settled ease of someone who is in exactly the right environment. She looked up when he came in. "Your Grace, I'm sorry Mr. Hargrove said the library was available for research use. If you need the room." "I don't need the room," he said. He had come for the property reference and found himself not moving toward the shelf where it lived. "What are you researching?" "Drainage systems," she said, which was not what he had expected, though he recognized that he should not have been surprised. "Historical methods. There are agricultural societies in the north that have been publishing case studies on heavy clay management for 30 years. Some of the approaches they describe are applicable to the Ashbourne lower fields. I wanted to understand what the options are before the drainage engineer presents his formal assessment." Edmund looked at the books open on the table. Agricultural Society publications, the kind of publications that technically existed in the library of every estate of this size and were practically never read, because the sort of people who managed large estates rarely read Agricultural Society case studies from the 1810s. He came further into the room and looked at one of the open volumes. "You found these in the library. They were on the lower shelves near the window. A previous duke, I imagine, based on the date of acquisition I found in the front pages. Someone had been following these publications for about 15 years and then stopped." She looked at the books with an expression that he was beginning to learn to read something that appeared to be simply professional interest and had other things moving beneath it. They were good material. It seemed a shame not to use them. Edmund looked at the room properly for the first time in perhaps several years. It was a very good room. He had known this abstractly in the way that he knew abstractly that the east wing had good morning light and the kitchen garden was productive, and the ballroom on the ground floor was one of the finest examples of its period in the county. He knew it as information. He had not been in it often enough to know it as a room. "My father collected most of these," he said. He looked at the shelves without quite intending to. He had good taste. He had more time than I have had. He was not the heir. My grandfather was still living when my father was this age, so he had years when the estate's management was not his responsibility. He spent them reading. Edmund looked at the desk in the corner. "He used to sit there. He said the east light was exactly right for reading. I came in here with him sometimes when I was small." He had not said this to anyone. He did not know why he was saying it now. Miss Whitmore was looking at him with the quiet attention she brought to things she was still in the process of understanding, not performing interest, but actually interested in the specific way of people who listen because they want to know rather than because they are waiting to respond. "You don't use it now," she said. "I don't have time for afternoons in the library." "Or you have told yourself you don't," she said with the directness she applied to everything, without softening it, but also without making it an accusation. Simply naming the thing clearly the way she named drainage problems. He looked at her. "My father had that room for years," he said. "I have had this estate for 17. At 19, I had advisors and tenants and land and debts and a title I had not yet grown into. There was not the library, was not the priority." "No," she said. "I understand that." A pause. "I came home after my father died, and the first thing I did was sort his papers. 3 days. I organized everything. It was the only thing I knew how to do with the feeling of it." Edmund was still. She looked at her books, not at him. "The estate manager's house where we lived, the Harton family let me stay for a month while I sorted his affairs. Everything he had spent 30 years building was technically their property. I packed what was mine and left. A brief pause. I had some savings and some skills, and a name that had limited social weight. I decided the skills were the most reliable of the three. And so you came to Ashbourne. Eventually. I worked in 3 other estates first. This is the first place where I have been invited into a council meeting, rather than relegated to verifying other people's arithmetic. She looked at him then directly. You asked me a question this morning. In the East Room. No one had asked me a question like that before. He held her gaze. I thought she is telling me something real. Not a complaint. Not a performance of difficulty. A simple statement of fact offered to someone she has decided is worth offering it to. He thought she does not do that easily. You were right to answer it, he said. And then, because he was a man who was precise about things that needed to be said. You have been right about a great many things since then. She looked at him with the assessment quality again. I know, she said. He found the property reference he had come for. He did not leave immediately. He sat down in the chair his father had used in the East Light, and he read the property reference, and Eleanor Whitmore continued her research into historical drainage management, and the November afternoon moved around them with the unhurried quality of a room that has been waiting for something, and has found tentatively that it is being given a use after all. The gossip began, as gossip in a county community tends to begin not with a dramatic event, but with the gradual accumulation of small observations. Lady Pemberton, whose husband was a neighboring landowner, and who therefore attended a sufficient quantity of county social events to maintain comprehensive awareness of everyone else's business, mentioned to Mrs. Aldridge at a dinner in late November that the Duke of Ashbourne appeared to have engaged a rather unusual consultant. Mrs. Aldridge, whose husband was Edmund's legal advisor, and who therefore had both some information and strict professional limits on sharing it, said something non-committal. Lady Pemberton, who interpreted non-committal responses as confirmation, mentioned it to 2 other people the following day. By the first week of December, the county's social network had generated a version of events that was approximately 40% accurate and entirely uncharitable. An unmarried woman of limited social standing was spending extended periods at Ashbourne Estate, in close professional proximity to the Duke, and whatever the professional explanation, the situation was, at minimum, irregular. Edmund was informed of this by Hargrove, who delivered the information in his usual style briefly without emphasis, leaving Edmund to determine the weight of it. There is some talk, Hargrove said, about Miss Whitmore's continued presence. I am aware, Edmund said. He had become aware approximately 3 days ago when a letter from Lord Aldgate, the head of the primary neighboring family, and a man whose opinion carried significant weight in the county, had arrived with a slightly peculiar warmth that he recognized as the warmth of someone establishing goodwill in anticipation of requiring a difficult conversation. The talk, Hargrove said carefully, is not about the quality of her work. No, Edmund said. It wouldn't be. He was quiet for a moment. Is she aware? He asked. I believe she is. She has not raised it. She would not, Edmund said. And she would not, he thought. She would note it and file it and continue working, because she had spent years working in environments that were not entirely comfortable for her, and she had decided that the discomfort was less important than the work. He found himself with a clarity that was somewhat uncomfortable deciding something. He made 2 decisions. The first was that he would not remove Miss Whitmore from her role at Ashbourne to quiet the gossip, because the gossip was without foundation and the work was valuable, and he was not in the practice of making estate decisions based on what Lady Pemberton found irregular. The second decision was that he would speak to Miss Whitmore directly, which he recognized was the more difficult of the 2, because it required acknowledging that there was something to address. He found her in the estate office after the morning accounts review. There is some discussion in the county, he said without preamble, because he had learned quickly that preamble with Eleanor Whitmore was wasted motion. About my presence here, she said also without preamble. Yes, I want you to know, he began. Your Grace, she said with the gentle firmness she used when she was stopping a conversation from going in the wrong direction. I am not concerned about the talk. I am concerned that you might feel obligated to respond to it in ways that would disrupt the estate work, which is currently at a critical point. She looked at him directly. I have managed professional situations that were discussed by people who had not been present for them before. It is not new. He looked at her. She was right, as she often was. She was also, he noted, handling the situation with a composure that cost her something. He could see it in the small particular stillness of someone who is maintaining a position rather than inhabiting it naturally. "It is not fair," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." A pause. "Very few things that affect women in professional positions are." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "I have been invited to attend Lord Aldgate's winter gathering. I would like you to come as part of the Ashbourne Estate representation. With Hargrove. Formally." She was still for a moment. "That is not strictly necessary," she said. "No, but it is accurate. Your involvement in the estate matters warrants the representation, and it addresses the talk more directly than ignoring it." He paused. "If you are comfortable with it." She looked at him with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether something was what it appeared to be. "Yes," she said. "I am comfortable with it." He nodded and turned to leave. "Your Grace," she said. He stopped. Thank you," she said, simply, without elaboration. He was aware walking back toward his study, through the east corridor, of a feeling that was not entirely comfortable, and also not uncomfortable. A feeling of having done a specific thing that was right, not because it was required, but because it was. He examined the feeling because it was what he wanted to do, for reasons that were not strictly estate-related. He was not sure what to do with this recognition. He was beginning to think he was going to have to do something with it eventually. The Aldgate Winter Gathering was held in the third week of December at Aldgate Park, which was a large, well-maintained estate, with precisely the kind of ballroom and long supper tables that county winter gatherings required. Eleanor wore her dark green dress. Edmund had noted this. He had been noting without entirely choosing to what Eleanor wore in various professional settings, which was the kind of thing he had never noticed about anyone, and was aware he was now noticing, and thought that it suited the occasion, and suited her in the specific way that clothing suits people who choose it for reasons beyond fashion. She dressed practically and well, and the effect was of someone who took herself seriously without requiring other people to acknowledge it. Lord Aldgate received them with a warmth that had the quality of someone who has adjusted his position since he last wrote Edmund a letter. The gathering included approximately 30 guests, neighboring landowners, their families, several county officials. Edmund moved through the room in the practiced way of a man who had attended 1,000 events like this one, speaking when spoken to, making the minimum number of commitments consistent with being a responsible neighbor, managing the social machinery with the efficiency that comes from long experience. He was also with the peripheral attention of someone who had become somewhat involuntarily alert to a specific person's situation, watching Eleanor. She was with Hargrove initially, which was appropriate. They spoke with Mr. Croft and his wife. She handled several introductions with a composure that he recognized was the composure of someone who had been doing this in unfamiliar rooms for years. Then Lady Pemberton reached her. Edmund did not hear the conversation. He saw the approach Lady Pemberton with the bright, specific warmth of a woman who has decided to be gracious, and he saw Eleanor's response, which was the polite, steady composure of someone who knew exactly what kind of gracious she was receiving. He moved in that direction, not quickly, not in a way that announced itself. By the time he arrived at Eleanor's side, Lady Pemberton had said whatever she had intended to say and was making a refined social retreat. Eleanor was looking at the room with the expression she wore when she was doing something with a feeling rather than expressing it. "Lady Pemberton," she said quietly to him. "Yes, I saw. She told me she had heard I was doing remarkable work at Ashbourne, with a quality of enthusiasm that made it clear she had decided this was the most diplomatic thing to say." Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then, "You handled it well." "I have had practice." A brief pause. "She is not unkind. She simply does not know what category to put me in, and people who do not know what category to use become uncomfortable." "What category would you suggest?" She looked at him. The assessment quality, but with something behind it that was less contained than usual. "A woman who does her work well and would appreciate being evaluated on that basis rather than on her social position." That is a reasonable category, he said. It is not a category that exists in county social gatherings. Perhaps it should. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "You said something this morning about the estate work being at a critical point. You're right. The drainage assessment comes back next week, and I've been going through the old records more carefully." A pause. "There are some things I need to tell you. Not tonight, but soon." Edmund registered the shift in her tone from the social moment to something more serious, more deliberate, the tone she used when she had found something in the accounts that required attention. "Soon?" he agreed. She nodded. He found himself in the carriage back to Ashbourne later that evening, thinking about the way she had said it. Not tonight, but soon, with the specific weight of something that had been considered before being spoken. He thought about everything she had said in the past several weeks. The patterns of it. The way she offered information with a precision that suggested she had already done the work of understanding it before she brought it to him. I thought about how tired he was of rooms where everyone told him things he already believed. He thought about how Eleanor Whitmore told him things he had not thought to ask about, and asked him things he had not been asked, and sat in his father's library, reading drainage case studies from the 1810s, because she had noticed they existed and thought they might be useful. He thought, sitting in the cold carriage on the road back to Ashbourne, that he had spent 17 years being a man who did not need anyone. He was no longer entirely sure this was as straightforward as he had believed. She came to his study on a Thursday afternoon in the third week of December. She had 3 documents with her. She set them on the desk with the deliberate order of someone who has planned the sequence. "I need to show you something," she said. "I found it in the old estate records in the box that predates Hargrove's filing system by about 15 years. I have been going through the older material systematically, and I came across several items that—" She stopped. "I want to show them to you directly, rather than summarizing them, because what they show depends on understanding the sequence." Edmund leaned forward. "Go ahead." She laid the first document on the desk. It was a letter dated nearly 20 years ago, addressed to the previous Duke of Ashbourne, Edmund's father. She said, "This is a letter from a creditor, notifying your father of a significant debt that had been concealed from the estate accounts by the estate financial manager at the time, a man named Cruz, who had been managing the accounts for 10 years. She placed her finger at a specific line. The amount, and below it, the date of notification. Edmund read the line. He read it again. "I was not aware of this," he said. "I thought you might not be. Your father died when you were 19. His papers were not, the transition was not organized apparently. Things were misfiled." She placed the second document beside the first. "This is a correspondence between Cruz and another party about the concealment. It was misfiled inside a bound volume of agricultural records from 1806. I believe it ended up there accidentally." She paused. "And this," she placed the third document, "is a letter from someone named G. Whitmore, written to your father 3 months before Cruz left the estate's employment, describing the discrepancy he had identified in the accounts, recommending an external review, outlining the figures he had found." Edmund was very still. He looked at the third document, at the signature at the bottom, George Whitmore. He looked up at Eleanor. Her expression was careful, not performing anything, simply careful with the quality of care that belongs to someone who is offering a true thing and is not sure how it will be received. "Your father," he said. "Yes." He identified the problem. He identified it, documented it, reported it to your father, and the report led directly to Cruz's removal from the estate's employment 3 months later. The crisis was resolved because of his intervention. She was very still. "The credit in the estate records goes to the external reviewer who was brought in afterward. My father's name doesn't appear in any subsequent documentation." Edmund looked at the 3 documents. He looked at them in order following the sequence. He felt something that was not quite anger, not at Eleanor, not at anyone present, but the specific feeling of a man encountering an old injustice that has been sitting in the dark for 2 decades, waiting to be seen. "He protected this estate," Edmund said. "Yes." "And received no recognition." "No. I was a paid employee," He did his work. The credit went to the people whose names mattered more. Her voice was entirely level. He would have said the work was the important thing. He was right. But, she stopped. But so was the credit, Edmund said. She looked at him. He had said her own words back to her from a different conversation weeks ago, and he watched her recognize it. Yes, she said quietly. He looked at the documents for a long moment. I thought about everything Eleanor had done in the past 2 months at Ashbourne. The council meeting, the northern section, the tenant consultations, the drainage research, the careful, thorough rebuilding of the estate accounts. The way she had done all of it, not to establish a claim, but simply because she understood that it needed doing, and she was the person best positioned to do it. I thought about what it meant that she had found these documents and brought them to him immediately, without using them. You could have, he began. No, she said. I couldn't. Simply. Without elaboration. He looked at her. Whatever my father did for Ashbourne, she said, is not mine to use as currency. He deserved recognition for it. That is a separate matter from what I am doing here, and what I hope you think of it. She held his gaze steadily. I brought these to you because they are part of Ashbourne's history, and you should have them, not because they change anything about my situation here. Edmund was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, They change how I understand your situation here. Please, I am not saying it to change your position, he said. I am saying it because it is true. You came here with skills that were already considerable, and a name that carries more weight in this county than you appear to know, and a professional history that any estate in Yorkshire would be fortunate to have. And you have spent 3 months doing your work without asking anyone to acknowledge any of that. She was looking at him with the expression she wore when something had surprised her, and she was not certain whether to permit herself to show it. I acknowledge it, he said. All of it, for what that is worth. The afternoon light came through the study windows in the particular December way, thin and clear, and Eleanor Whitmore stood across his desk with 3 documents between them and an expression he was learning to read. Not the assessment quality, not the watchful quality, but something that sat beneath both of those. Something that did not have a name yet, but that he was aware of with the specific attention of a man who has found something valuable and is very carefully making note of its location. It is worth a great deal, she said, quietly, simply. He held her gaze for a moment. Then she gathered the documents and said she would have them properly preserved, and she left. Edmund sat at his desk in the December light and found himself thinking about a woman who worked in rooms that were not designed for her and found things in misfiled boxes and brought them to the person they belonged to without using them for herself. He found himself thinking she is the most honest person I have met since my father. He found himself thinking I do not want her to leave Ashbourne. He had not until this moment permitted himself to think this clearly. He was somewhat startled to discover he was thinking it now. He was more startled to discover how clear it was. 3 days before Christmas, a letter arrived from Lord Casworth. Lord Casworth was 63, a powerful figure in the Northern County network, and the head of a family that had been allied with the Wycliffes in various ways for 2 generations. He wrote with the friendly formality of a man delivering a message. He expects to be received well, and his message was in summary as follows. His daughter, Miss Arabella Casworth, was 24, recently returned from a year in London, accomplished, well-connected, and currently without a marital arrangement. The Casworth family wished to make known their interest in a connection with Ashbourne, which would bring with it considerable social benefit to both families. Access to the Casworth agricultural lands in the northwest of the county, which bordered Ashbourne's northern section, and a financial arrangement that would resolve Ashbourne's remaining credit difficulties at a stroke. Edmund set the letter down. He sat at his desk for a long time. He was a man who made decisions by examining the relevant factors with complete honesty and then choosing the course most consistent with his responsibilities. He had done this since he was 19. It had served him as a method reasonably well. He examined the relevant factors. The Casworth alliance was by every rational measure an excellent solution to the estate's situation. The financial terms were generous. The social connection was valuable. Arabella Casworth was by all accounts a pleasant and accomplished young woman who would fulfill the role of Duchess of Ashbourne with complete competence. He sat with these factors for a long time. He found himself thinking about a conversation in a library, about afternoon light through east-facing windows, about a woman who had told him he had the right to use the library because otherwise he was simply saying he didn't permit himself time that wasn't justified by productivity, and the way she had said it, not as criticism, but as a simple naming of the thing, the way she named everything. He found himself thinking about the woman who had protected his estate's history from her own claim on it and handed it to him without qualification. He found himself thinking, if I accept this proposal, I will be accepting a life in which I spend the rest of my years doing what is rational and not what I... He stopped. He looked at the letter. He thought, I need more time. He wrote a careful, courteous response to Lord Casworth indicating his appreciation and his need to give the matter full consideration before responding substantively. He did not tell Eleanor. He told himself this was because the matter was not yet decided. He suspected in the part of himself he was not yet ready to address directly that the real reason was something different. January at Ashbourne was the coldest month. The estate closed in around itself, the way large properties do in deep winter. The working rhythms, continuing the fires built high, the daily management of land and tenants and correspondence proceeding with the particular focused efficiency of a household that has survived many such Januaries. The mornings were dark until nearly 9. The afternoons were done by 3:30. Eleanor had been at Ashbourne for 3 months. She had stopped thinking of it as temporary sometime in December. She was not certain when exactly. There was no specific moment she could point to, no clear decision she had made. It had simply happened the way that some things happen gradually and then completely. The estate office had become her office. The library on the second floor had become the place she went when she needed to think the kitchen staff had begun, including a preference for her coffee in the morning routine, and she had stopped measuring her presence in terms of duration. She had also stopped being entirely successful at managing the other thing. This was less expected. She had managed in the various professional situations of the past 6 years to maintain a clear separation between her working life and the other kind of life, the kind that included feelings about people, which she had learned to treat with the same careful organization she brought to estate records. She organized those feelings into appropriate categories. She maintained appropriate distance. She was, by her own assessment, remarkably good at not feeling things she could not do anything constructive with. She was being in December and into January considerably less successful at this than usual. She knew why. Edmund Wycliffe was not easy to manage feelings about because he was not a man she had expected. She had arrived at Ashbourne prepared for the version of him that the county's reputation suggested: a powerful, reserved, slightly difficult man, whose estate was in trouble and who needed practical help rather than a relationship with the person providing it. She had been professionally comfortable with this prospect. She was good at providing practical help without requiring more from a situation than the situation offered. She had not been prepared for a man who would ask her a genuine question in front of a room full of people who expected him not to, who would come to find her in a library and stay to read, who would hear about tenant families and go speak to them himself the next day, who would, when she brought him evidence that could have changed the entire nature of their working relationship, simply say, "I acknowledge it, all of it." She had not been prepared for him to be someone She stopped when the thought arrived and set it in the careful category where she had been putting things she was not yet ready to examine. But the category was becoming difficult to maintain, and she had not told him about the letter. The letter had arrived in late December, forwarded to her through Mr. Croft from her previous professional contact, a woman who managed a registry for domestic professional services throughout Yorkshire. It was from a family in the East, riding a large estate called Thornfield Park, whose land manager had recently retired, requesting Miss Whitmore's interest in a permanent senior position managing the estate's accounts and tenant affairs. It was an excellent offer, better by practical measure than any she had previously received. A permanent post, a proper salary, a defined professional role with real authority. She had read it 3 times and put it in her notebook and not mentioned it to anyone. She had told herself this was because she needed time to consider it. This was true. She did need time to consider it. She was also aware with the uncomfortable clarity of a woman who had spent 6 years being very honest with herself about practical matters that she was not considering it the way she should be. She was not weighing the offer against her current situation with the clean, rational analysis she applied to estate accounts. She was doing something else. She was avoiding the consideration because the consideration required her to confront what it was she was actually weighing it against. She was weighing it against staying at Ashbourne. And she was weighing it against a feeling she had put in a category that was becoming too small to contain it. Casworth proposal in mid-January. Not from Edmund. From Hargrove, who mentioned it as a matter of estate information that she might need to factor into her planning, and who delivered the information in his usual style briefly without emphasis, leaving her to determine the weight of it. She thanked him and went back to the accounts she had been reviewing, and did not think about it for the rest of the working morning. Then she went to the library after dinner, and she sat in the chair that she thought of as hers, now, which was an error of the kind she had promised herself not to make, and she thought about it carefully and honestly. Lord Casworth's daughter. 24. Well-connected. Financially beneficial to the estate. An alliance that solved problems Ashbourne genuinely had. She sat with this and applied the same honest analysis she applied to drainage surveys and tenant records and estate accounts. The analysis was clear. The proposal was everything Edmund's position required. She had spent 3 months looking at Ashbourne's situation in detail, and she understood exactly what a connection of this kind would provide, and she understood that providing it was what Edmund's responsibilities demanded. She understood this. She also understood, sitting in the library in the January dark, that she had made an error of a kind she had promised herself not to make. She had let the category become too full. She had let the feeling become something she could not organize away. She would not say anything about it, not because she was resigned to it. She was not a woman who resigned herself to things without a fight, but because there was nothing to say. Her position had not changed. She was a professional engaged to assist the estate. She had no claim, and she had not sought one. She would write back to Thornfield Park. She would give the offer its proper consideration. She would continue doing her work at Ashbourne for the time remaining. She would not let any of this show. She was very good at not letting things show. This was she had learned both the most useful and most costly skill she possessed. She had developed it at 15 when her mother had died, and she had understood intuitively that her father was struggling with his grief and could not also manage hers, and she had organized her feelings into the appropriate category and been useful. She had developed it further in the professional environments where she was the only woman in the room, where showing uncertainty was the equivalent of providing evidence against yourself. She was good at it. She was doing it now in her interactions with Edmund, maintaining the professional composure, bringing the work, continuing with the systematic archive review and the tenant consultations and the ongoing drainage project, and doing all of it with the same quality of attention as before. He noticed. She had not expected him to notice. He was a man who was very attentive to professional matters, and considerably less attentive to, she had believed, the quieter signals of how a person was actually doing. She had been underestimating him. He came to find her in the estate office on a Tuesday morning in the second week of January. He closed the door, which he did not usually do. "You are managing something," he said. She looked up from the ledger she was reviewing. "I don't know what you mean," she said. This was not technically accurate. "You have been working for 3 days with the specific composure of someone who has decided to work through something they are not going to bring up." He sat down across from her with the directness he had been using more frequently over the past several weeks, the directness of a man who had decided that something other than professional efficiency was worth the directness. "What has happened?" She held his gaze for a moment. She thought, "I will not tell him about the Casworth proposal. That is his private matter, and none of my business, and I would not embarrass either of us by indicating I know about it." She thought, "I will not tell him about Thornfield Park. Not yet." She said, "I have been going through the older archive records. There are some items that I have not finished assessing." She paused. "I am also considering some professional matters that require thought." He looked at her steadily. He had the quality she had come to know of someone who could wait. Most people were uncomfortable with silence and filled it. Edmund Wycliffe was comfortable with silence and let it do its work. She held her position for a moment. Then she said, "I received an offer from an estate in the East Riding, a permanent post." She kept her voice entirely level. "It is a good offer." Edmund was still. "I see," he said. "It arrived in December. I have been considering it." A pause. "And I haven't decided." She looked at the ledger. "I am trying to consider it honestly, which requires thinking clearly about what I want, which is—" She stopped. "Which I have been finding somewhat difficult." He said, "What makes it difficult?" She looked up at him. How was watching her with the full specific attention that she had come to understand meant he was paying real attention, not performing it. The quality of looking he brought to things that mattered to him. She thought, "I cannot say what makes it difficult." She said, "I have been at Ashbourne longer than any other estate. The work here is the most meaningful work I have done professionally. I have been trying to determine how much weight to give that." He held her gaze. "Ashbourne would be very sorry to lose you," he said. The formal phrasing, but something in his voice that was not formal. She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. She went back to the ledger. He did not leave immediately, which she was aware of, and then he did leave, and she sat in the estate office with the ledger open in front of her, and the January light coming through the window, and the quiet of a house she had come to feel without deciding to was her own. She thought, "I need to make a decision." She thought, "I cannot make a decision while I am still in the middle of what the decision is about." She thought about writing to Thornfield Park that week, about setting a date to depart Ashbourne, about giving herself the clean space of distance and separation in which to think clearly about what she actually wanted. She opened the ledger and found the page she had been reviewing. The numbers waited for her patient, and clear the way numbers always were. She went back to work. The discovery happened on a Thursday. She was in the oldest section of the archive, a room off the east wing that preceded even Hargrove's filing system. A room full of boxes and bound volumes that had been waiting for decades for someone with patience enough to go through them, and she was working methodically, as she always worked, box by box, volume by volume. She opened a bound volume of estate correspondence from approximately 40 years ago and found tucked inside the back cover, in the way that documents were sometimes stored when there was no other convenient place, a set of papers. She looked at them. They were financial documents. Old ones. The paper had the particular quality of age, slightly brittle at the edges, the ink faded, but legible. She read the heading of the first page and felt the particular stillness that came over her when she encountered something in the archive that was more significant than expected. She read the remaining pages slowly and carefully. Then she sat back and thought about what she had found. The documents were correspondence and accounting records from 17 years ago, predating Edmund's management of the estate, from the period immediately following the previous Duke's death, the transition period when Edmund at 19 had inherited everything. They described a situation she had not known about. In the first year of Edmund's management, the estate had faced a financial crisis more serious than the current difficulties, a combination of the concealed debt from the cruise period, which had not been entirely resolved by the Whitmore intervention she already knew about, and a catastrophic harvest season that had reduced income sharply. The records showed the estate had been within months of a formal default. And then the records showed something else. An arrangement with a private creditor. A personal loan secured not against the estate's assets, but against a set of personal valuables. The Wycliffe family collection of historical manuscripts and documents, which she knew existed because she had been managing the catalog of them for the past 3 months. The loan had resolved the immediate crisis. The manuscripts had been gradually redeemed over the following decade as the estate's income recovered. The last page of the documents was a letter from the creditor dated 12 years ago, confirming the final redemption of the arrangement and the return of the last item of the collection. She read the letter through to the signature. The private creditor's name was not one she recognized, but the address was in the same village as the Harton estate, where her father had spent his career. She looked at the address for a long time, She cross-referenced it against the correspondence in her father's papers that she had organized after his death and kept because she could not bring herself to discard anything he had touched. She did not have the Harton papers with her at Ashbourne, but she had her memory and her father's handwriting and 30 years of careful documentation of everything he had done, and she had a very strong feeling about what she would find if she sent for the relevant box from the storage she had arranged in the village after leaving the Harton cottage. She put the documents aside and thought for a long time. Her father had known. He had known about the crisis at Ashbourne when Edmund was 19. He had found a solution. The way he had always found solutions quietly, without announcement, arranging things so that the disaster did not happen and the credit went to whoever managed the public resolution. She had grown up in a family where the valuable work was done invisibly. She had not known until this moment how literally true that was. She sat in the old archive room with the January cold coming through the inadequate windows, and she felt something that was large and complicated and included grief and anger and a strange warm pride and something else she was not ready to name. She thought Edmund should know this. She thought this changes things. She thought, I do not want it to change things. I do not want him to know this and feel a debt. I do not want him to look at me differently because of what my father did for his family. She wanted him to. She stopped. She thought, I know what I want. The clarity of it was somewhat alarming. She put the documents in the preservation envelope she had started keeping in her bag for significant finds. She labeled the envelope carefully the way she labeled everything. She did not take it to Edmund that day. She needed to think about what it meant first, about what she was going to do with it, about whether it changed the other decisions she was trying to make. She went back to the archive and continued working. And the Thursday afternoon moved around her with the unhurried quality of a day that does not know it has produced a revelation. That evening she wrote to Thornfield Park. She wrote that she was grateful for the offer and needed a small additional period of consideration, and she would respond with her final decision by the end of January. She sealed the letter. She looked at it for a moment. She thought a woman who had spent her professional life arriving in situations where she was needed, providing what was needed, and then leaving when the situation changed. She had been good at leaving. She had told herself this was because she was self-sufficient, because she did not form attachments to the places she worked, because she was always moving toward the next thing. She was less certain sitting in her room at Ashbourne, with a sealed letter on the desk in front of her, and a revelation still warm in her mind that this was the full truth of it. She thought, I have been leaving before I could be required to leave. She thought about her father, about how he had spent 30 years managing things for people who did not acknowledge him, and how he had called the work the most important thing, and how she had believed him. How she had made his philosophy her own. The work is the thing, not the credit, not the connection. She thought he did not choose that. It was chosen for him. She thought, I am choosing it. And I am choosing it because it feels safer than wanting something that might not want me back. She looked at the sealed letter. She left it on the desk. She went to bed and lay awake for a long time in the January dark, listening to the sounds of the old house settling around her, and she thought about a man who had come to find her in the estate office and sat across from her and asked simply, what has happened? As though it mattered to him, as though she mattered. She thought, I need to tell him about the documents. She thought, I need to know what it means first. She thought, I need to stop deciding things in the middle of the night when I cannot think clearly. She closed her eyes. Outside, the January wind moved through the grounds of Ashbourne Estate and past the northern fields that were waiting for spring, and past the gardens that were bare but would not always be bare, and across the front gates where the name Wycliffe was carved into the stone by a family that had survived a great deal and intended to survive more. She fell asleep thinking about her father. She fell asleep thinking about a choice she was not yet ready to name. She told him about the documents 2 days later. She went to his study after breakfast with the preservation envelope, and she set it on his desk, and she explained in the careful, precise way she explained everything, what she had found, and what it appeared to mean. He listened without interrupting. He read the documents she indicated. He read the letter from the creditor with the Harton address. He was quiet for a long time. Your father, he said. I believe so. I have sent for his papers from storage to confirm. But the address, the timeline, the structure of the arrangement, I believe it was him. Edmund looked at the letter. He arranged a private loan during the crisis. A personal loan, not a formal financial instrument. He used connections he had from 30 years of estate management in that area. He paused. He kept the manuscripts in the family. Yes. Without telling anyone. Yes. I was quiet again. Then, he saved the estate. Possibly, she said. There may have been other factors. The records show this arrangement resolved the immediate crisis, but the estate's recovery depended on subsequent management as well. I don't want to overstate it. Eleanor, he said. Her name simply directly the way he had been using it more frequently since December. She held his gaze. Your father saved this estate, he said. The way he saved it before with the cruise matter, quietly, without credit. Yes, she said. He looked at the documents for a moment. Then he looked at her. And you brought these to me without... He stopped. You could have... I know. She said it before he finished, because she wanted to say it herself. I could have. I chose not to. She held his gaze steadily. What my father did for Ashbourne is not mine to hold over you or use for my benefit. He did it because he believed the work mattered. I believe he was right. A pause. I brought these to you because they belong to the estate's history. They should be preserved and acknowledged. That is all. Edmund looked at her for a long silent moment. She could not fully read his expression. It was the expression he wore when he was working through something significant and had not yet reached his conclusion. She had come to know this expression well. She had learned that when it appeared, the best response was to wait. She waited. He said, I have been trying to determine... He stopped, started differently. There is a proposal, from Casworth. She had not expected him to raise it. She kept her expression carefully level. Yes, she said. Hargrove mentioned it. He looked up. What do you think of it? The question arrived, like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples moving outward before she could stop them. She thought about every honest response and the cost of each one. She said, I think it would solve problems the estate genuinely has. The financial terms Hargrove mentioned are... That isn't what I asked, he said. She was quiet for a moment. She thought he is asking me something real. He is asking me with the quality of attention he brings to things that matter to him. He is asking me the way he asked me what the Northern Farm Plan missed. She thought if I give him the professional answer, I am choosing a lie by another name. She thought I have never lied to him. She said, I think it is the choice your situation requires, and I think you know that, and I think... She stopped, started again. I think you would not be asking me if you had already decided. He looked at her. No, he said. I have not decided. She was very still. I have not decided, he said again, because I am aware that my situation requires one thing, and I am... He stopped. He had the particular expression of a man who is coming to the edge of something he has not yet permitted himself to say aloud. I find myself uncertain about the relationship between what my situation requires and what I... He stopped again. She said very quietly, I will tell you something. He looked at her. I received an offer, from another estate, a permanent post. She kept her voice level. I have been considering it. He was still. I have been considering it, she said, because I recognize that I was in danger of weighing something I should not be weighing against it. He held her gaze with the full, complete attention, not performing it actually present. What were you weighing it against? He asked. She looked at him. She thought I will not lie to him. She said you. The study was very quiet. Edmund looked at her across the desk, with the 3 documents between them and 17 years of careful controlled management of everything he felt, and something in his expression was coming apart very slowly and very visibly in the way of things that have been held too long in the same position. He said, Eleanor. She said, I am not telling you this to change your decision. I understand what your responsibilities are. I have spent 3 months cataloging them in detail. She kept her voice steady. I am telling you because I have been honest with you about everything else, and I could not be honest with you about this and pretend otherwise. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. She said, "The Thornfield offer is good. I am considering it seriously. Whatever you decide about Casworth, that is your decision to make, and I would not want you to feel that." "Eleanor," he said again. She stopped. He stood up from behind his desk. She had not expected this. She had expected something. A careful, measured response. A professional acknowledgement. The controlled composure he brought to every difficult thing. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, looking out at the January estate. He said, "I have been making decisions for 17 years based on what the estate requires, what the family requires, what duty requires." His voice was quiet and entirely even. "I have been good at it. I have made it the entire architecture of my life. The estate and the family and the duty." She waited. "I have been telling myself," he said, "that the Casworth proposal is the rational choice, that it is what the situation requires, that choosing it is the responsible thing." A pause. "I have been telling myself this for 3 weeks, and I have not been convincing myself." He turned from the window. He looked at her. "I have not been convincing myself," he said, "because the argument for the rational choice has a counter-argument I have been refusing to examine." He held her gaze. "The counter-argument is that I have spent 17 years doing what the situation required, and at the end of all of it, I am standing in a cold study in January, trying to make myself believe that the most important decision of my life should be made on the same basis as a drainage survey." She was very still. "I find," he said, "that I cannot do that." Eleanor looked at him. She thought about everything she had promised herself she would not do, and then she thought about the category that had become too full, and then she stopped thinking about what she had promised herself. She said, "What will you do instead?" He looked at her with the expression that was no longer managed, no longer arranged, simply present. "I would like," he said, "to ask you to stay at Ashbourne." She held his gaze. "Not as the professional consultant," he said. "Not in the role I engaged you for." A pause. "I am aware that this is not a formal offer. I am aware that I have not done the proper things in the proper order. I am asking whether you would consider—" He stopped. "I am asking whether there is any version of this in which you would stay." The January light came through the study windows in the pale, particular way of winter light that does not claim to be more than it is simply present, simply clear. Eleanor looked at Edmund Wycliffe, who was standing at his window, with 17 years of careful management coming loose at the seams, and she thought, this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like when someone who has been carrying everything alone finally puts it down and looks at you and asks. She thought, "I have been waiting for this, and I did not know I was waiting." She thought, "I have been in this room before. Not this room, but this position being offered something real by someone real, and finding all the usual reasons to decline it to protect myself, to maintain the distance that felt safe. She thought, I am going to choose differently." "Yes," she said. She said it simply without elaboration, because it did not require elaboration. Edmund looked at her. I was very still for a moment. Then he said, "I should speak to you properly. There are things I need to say properly." "Not tonight," she said gently. "Not all of it tonight." She looked at him with the honesty she had brought to every other exchange between them. "Tonight I would like you to know that I am not going anywhere. The rest can be done correctly." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. She gathered her envelope from the desk. "The documents," she said, returning to practical ground, because some part of her felt that the practical ground was where they were steadiest, where they always had been steadiest. "I will have them properly preserved and added to the archive record. Your family's history deserves the accurate record." "Yes," he said. She was almost at the door. "Eleanor," he said. She turned. He looked at her with the full attention, the real thing, not managed, not performed. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it, for everything you found, for not using it." A pause. "For being honest." "It is what I know how to do," she said. She went out. Behind her she heard nothing, but she was aware with the particular sense she had developed for the movements beneath the surface of this house that something had shifted. Something that had been held in the wrong position for a long time had been permitted to move. She walked down the corridor of Ashbourne toward the library, and the January dark was outside the windows, and the house was warm and quiet around her. She thought, I am staying. She thought I chose to stay. She had spent 6 years arriving in places and leaving them before she could be required to leave. She had just for the first time chosen the opposite. She found, examining the feeling carefully as she climbed the stairs to the library, that she was not afraid of it. She thought, I will be perhaps in the morning. She thought, I think I will manage it. She sat down in her chair by the east window and opened her book and let the house settle around her. The letter from Lord Casworth arrived on a Friday 2 weeks after the conversation in the study. It was a follow-up, politely worded, gently pressing for a response. Edmund had not responded to the initial letter. He had intended to respond, had composed several versions in his mind, and discarded them, had told himself he was waiting until he had thought through the situation properly. He read the follow-up at his desk on a gray February morning, and understood reading it that he had been waiting for something specific, a moment in which the decision became clear rather than merely rational. The conversation with Eleanor had not made things easier exactly. It had made them clearer, which was a different thing. He understood now what he actually wanted, which was useful in a practical sense, and made the responsible choice considerably more difficult to convince himself of. He had spent the 2 weeks since the conversation being a man who knew exactly what he wanted and was attempting to determine whether wanting it made the decision any different. He was a man of 17 years' practice in doing what the situation required, regardless of what he wanted. How was discovering that practice did not necessarily make this easier in the specific case, where what the situation required and what he wanted were, for the first time in memory, pointing in opposite directions. He spoke to Hargrove on a Saturday morning. He did this not because he required Hargrove's opinion exactly, but because Hargrove was the one person in his life who had been present for all 17 years and who understood the full picture without requiring Edmund to explain it. He could say certain things to Hargrove that would have taken lengthy explanation with anyone else. He said, I am going to decline the Casworth proposal. Hargrove looked at him. The financial situation, Hargrove said carefully, will not improve without a resolution. I know. Lord Casworth will likely be the relationship with that family. I know, Edmund said. I am aware of the costs. He paused. I want you to tell me if you believe I am making a serious mistake. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. In 12 years, he had given Edmund one piece of advice that Edmund had not initially wanted to hear, and it had concerned the management of the estate's eastern woodland, and Edmund had acted on it, and the eastern woodland had improved considerably. He had given no other unsolicited advice in the entire period. The Casworth alliance, Hargrove said finally, would solve the financial difficulty. It would also, he paused in the way he paused when he was selecting words carefully. An alliance made for financial convenience is not always the same as an unhappy one. Many people build good lives within practical arrangements. Yes, Edmund said. However, Hargrove said still carefully, I have observed over 12 years that you are a man who does his work with complete dedication to the outcome. You give everything to what you believe is worth giving everything to. A pause. I have wondered sometimes whether the estate is the correct recipient of everything. Edmund was quiet. That is not, Hargrove said, a comment on your management. Your management is excellent. It is an observation that excellent management and a complete life are not the same thing. Edmund looked at the window. You have been different, Hargrove said more quietly, since October, since Miss Whitmore arrived. He paused. I do not say this to create complications. I say it because it is true, and I believe you know it is true, and I think the relevant question is not what the situation requires, but what you believe you owe to yourself. Edmund looked at him. I was 19 when my brother died, he said. I inherited everything before I was prepared. I have spent 17 years trying to be ready enough, experienced enough sufficient. He stopped. I have not thought very often about what I owe to myself. No, Hargrove said. I know. He left. Edmund sat at the desk. He looked at the letter from Casworth. He wrote a response. It was courteous, appreciative, and clear. He wrote that he was grateful for the Casworth family's confidence and was not in a position to pursue the proposed alliance. He wrote that he hoped the relationship between the families would continue on its existing friendly terms. He wrote nothing about his reasons. He sealed the letter. He felt something that was not quite relief. Something larger than relief. Something that did not have a name yet, but that he recognized as the feeling of a man who has just made the first decision in 17 years that was not made on behalf of the estate. He had made it on behalf of himself. He sent the letter. He told Eleanor the following morning. She was in the library when he found her the chair by the east window. Her notebook opened the February light coming through the glass with the particular quality of light that is beginning to think about becoming spring. She looked up when he entered and did not perform surprise, which meant she had half expected him. "I have written to Lord Casworth," he said. She was still. "I have declined the proposal," he said, simply without elaboration. She looked at him with the expression that sat beneath the watchful and the assessing, the one that he was beginning to be able to read. The one that meant she was feeling something and managing how fully to show it. "Edmund," she said. It was the first time she had used his name without the title. He sat down in the chair across from hers, the same positions as the first afternoon in the library, the October afternoon when he had come for a property reference and stayed because he did not want to leave. He looked at her. "I want to tell you something," he said, "that I should have told you earlier, that I have been finding ways not to say because I was not sure what the appropriate time was, and I was not sure I had the right." She said, "You don't have to find the right words." He looked at her. "You don't?" she said. "I have watched you for 4 months work very hard to say every important thing precisely. I appreciate it. But I know what this is." She held his gaze with the directness she brought to everything. "And I think perhaps you should simply say it the way it is, which is rarely the most elegant version, but is usually the most true." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am in love with you." He said it simply in the same way he had said other true things. "I acknowledge it, all of it, and your father saved this estate without decoration, without the management of how it might be received." Eleanor looked at him with the expression he now knew was the one that lived beneath all the others, the one she showed when she was not performing anything at all. She said, "I know that I am not what your situation recommends. No. I know that there are people in this county who will consider your judgment poor. Yes. I know that the financial difficulty is real and the Casworth solution was practical and that there are costs to declining it." "I am aware of the costs," he said. "I have been thinking about them for several weeks. I have been making decisions based on costs for 17 years. He held her gaze. "I find that I am no longer able to make this one that way." She was very still. He said, "I have been in the years since I took the estate. I have worked very hard at becoming the Duke of Ashbourne, at being what the title required, at carrying everything my brother left me with without being what my brother was." A pause. "My brother was warm. He made friends easily. He loved people readily in the way that I have never been easy with." He paused again. "I believed for a long time that this was correct, that warmth was something I could not afford, that the estate required precision and discipline and careful management, not the openness that had not served my brother well." "Edmund, I am not saying this as self-criticism," he said. "I am saying it because I want you to understand what I am telling you." He held her gaze. "You arrived in October and asked me a question I had not been asked. And then you asked me more questions, and you looked at things the way I look at things, with the real attention, not the performed attention. And you told me the truth in rooms where the truth was not welcome, and you found things no one else had been patient enough to look for." A pause. "And somewhere in the middle of all of that, I realized that the estate did not require everything, that a man can manage his responsibilities and also—" He stopped. "And also have a reason for managing them that is not purely obligation." She was looking at him with the expression that sat beneath everything else. She said, "I have been in rooms all my life where I was useful and not seen. I made my peace with it. I decided the work was the thing." She paused. And then I came to Ashbourne, and you asked me a question in a room full of men who expected you not to, and I thought perhaps that is not the only thing." He looked at her. "I am not easy," she said. "I say things rooms do not want to hear. I will disagree with you. I will find things in the archive that complicate the picture. I will—" "Eleanor," he said. She stopped. "Those are not flaws," he said. "Those are why I am sitting in this chair having this conversation." She looked at him. Then she said, "Yes." He said, "I haven't asked yet." She said, "You were getting there." He looked at her. The directness, the precision, the honesty that she brought to everything, including this, and he found the thing in his expression that he had not permitted in 17 years finally arriving at the surface without his managing it there. "Eleanor Whitmore," he said, "will you marry me?" She said yes, simply, without elaboration. The way she answered everything she was certain about. He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and the February morning went on. Being a February morning around them, quiet and pale, and full of the particular patience of things that are coming towards spring. The social consequences arrived as Edmund had known they would, with the efficiency of a county network that had been monitoring the situation for several months, and required only the announcement to deploy its prepared positions. Lord Casworth was gracious and cool in equal measure. The letter he sent in response to Edmund's formal announcement of the engagement was brief, correctly worded, and contained the specific warmth of someone who has decided to maintain the form of the relationship from which the substance has been withdrawn. Lady Pemberton told 3 people the same morning she heard the news, and by the afternoon the county had generated several interpretations of the event, none of which were accurate, and most of which shared the common feature of positioning Eleanor as either a cunning schemer or a remarkable anomaly, depending on the speaker's prior opinion of Edmund. Lord Aldgate wrote a thoughtful, measured letter of congratulation that said very little and meant Edmund suspected that Aldgate was waiting to see how things developed before committing to a position. This was Aldgate's usual style, and Edmund respected it. Several other families to varying degrees indicated in various ways that they found the match unusual. Edmund read the responses as they arrived and filed them in the appropriate category, which was known costs already accounted for. He told Eleanor about each one. He showed her the letters when she wanted to see them. He did not manage her reaction or soften his account of the situation. She read the letters with the expression she wore in the archive when she encountered damage she was assessing honestly. Then she said about each one, "That is understandable," or "That is less understandable," or about Lady Pemberton's particular interpretation, "That says more about her than about us." He found this consistently the most useful response available. He also told her about the financial situation without softening it. He sat down with her in the estate office one morning with the accounts and the Hargrove projections, and he went through the numbers honestly. The Casworth alliance had represented a significant financial improvement. Without it, the estate's recovery timeline was longer. There were decisions to be made that were not comfortable. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "I want to see the full accounts, not the summary, the full picture." He said, "They're yours." She spent 3 days with the accounts and the agricultural projections and the tenant records and the drainage assessment reports, and then she came to him with a set of recommendations that were careful and specific, and in several cases more creative than anything his advisors had proposed. One of them involved a proposal for improving the northern section's productivity using the farming knowledge. The tenant families had provided the accumulated expertise that the surveys had never captured, and the consolidation plan had been about to discard. Another involved a systematic approach to the estate's historical collection that she believed could generate real income from scholarly interest if properly managed. The third involved reaching out to an agricultural society in the north that had been publishing relevant case studies for 30 years, and whose network of estates might provide useful cooperative arrangements. He looked at her across the desk. "Where did this come from?" he said. "I have been thinking about it since October," she said. The drainage case studies referenced several cooperative approaches between estates, and Mr. Hollis described farming methods that are genuinely novel. "I believe there are other estates with similar clay composition challenges that would benefit from what he knows, and he would benefit from the professional recognition. She paused. Your estate has knowledge in it that has not been valued. I think it can be. He looked at her. I thought she arrived at Ashbourne 3 months before I asked her to stay, and she had already been planning the estate's future. He thought she was doing it not because she expected to stay, but because she could not look at a problem without thinking about the solution. He said, I would like to implement all of this. She said, good. I need Hargrove's cooperation on the tenant outreach component, and I want the drainage engineer back for a second assessment before we finalize the northern plan. He said, you will have whatever you need. She nodded. She picked up her notebook. Then she said without looking up, Edmund. He said yes. She said, I want you to know that I am not here because of the estate. I want the estate to thrive, and I intend to work toward that with everything I have. But I want you to know that it is not the reason. He said, I know. She looked up at him. I know, he said again. I have known that for some time. She held his gaze. Good, she said. She went back to her notebook. The hardest conversation was with Lord Casworth. Edmund had not sought the conversation. He had expected to manage the situation through correspondence, which was the standard approach to these matters. But Casworth had ridden to Ashbourne in mid-February, unannounced, and asked to speak with Edmund directly. They sat in the study. Casworth was a man of 63, with the particular dignity of someone who has been important for a long time and has organized his sense of himself around that importance. He was not, by Edmund's assessment, a cruel man. He was a man who had had his expectation disappointed and had come to say so clearly. He said it clearly. He said that he had understood the proposal to be under serious consideration, that he had made certain preparations in anticipation of the alliance that the unexpected development was. He paused, choosing the word carefully, inconvenient. Edmund said, I understand. I apologize for the uncertainty the delay in my response created. Casworth said, I find it difficult to understand the decision. Edmund said, I imagine you do. Casworth said, the woman is... He stopped. He was a man of 63 who had decided to say something and was determining how to say it in a room where the man across from him had made his position clear. She is not what I would have expected. No, Edmund said. She is not. She has no position, Casworth said. No significant family connections in the county. The professional situation she has occupied here is... He paused again, irregular. Edmund looked at him directly. He said, she is the most capable person I have worked with. She has improved this estate's position significantly in 4 months. She is honest in rooms where honesty is not welcome. She is... He paused, choosing his own word. She is the person I would choose regardless of the situation. The situation has not changed that. Casworth looked at him for a long moment. He said, You are certain? Edmund said, Yes. Casworth looked at the window, then back. He said, Your grandfather chose your grandmother against the advice of everyone around him. She was the daughter of a Northumberland farmer. A pause. He used to say she was the best decision he made. Edmund said nothing. I am not, Casworth said, a man who changes his opinions quickly, but I am also not a man who respects someone less for knowing his own mind. He stood. I hope you will not find that my family's goodwill is as unavailable as you may be expecting. He shook Edmund's hand and left. Edmund sat at the desk. He thought about his grandfather and a woman from Northumberland. He had not known this. He had not known many things about his family that were apparently available if one was willing to look. He thought about how much of a family's real history lived in the uncelebrated places, in the misfiled boxes and the private arrangements and the things done quietly without credit. He thought about Eleanor sitting in the old archive room in January, finding the documents that had saved his estate. He thought, I want to know all of it, everything that was done quietly and without credit. I want the archive of this family to tell the accurate story. He thought, I want Eleanor to be the one who helps me find it. In March, Edmund went to the northern section and spoke to the tenant families. He told them the consolidation plan had been abandoned. He told them the drainage work was going forward, and the farming cooperation proposal was being developed. He told them carefully in the specific way Eleanor had taught him, not as a performance of generosity, but as a factual statement of the situation that their knowledge of the land they farmed was considered by the estate to be an asset rather than an inconvenience. Gareth Hollis looked at him with the expression he had worn at their first meeting, the wariness of someone assessing whether a thing is genuine. Then he said, "Your Grace, my grandfather farmed this land." "I know," Edmund said. "I had thought—" He stopped. "I had thought we might be the last." "No," Edmund said. "I hope not." Hollis looked at the land that his grandfather had farmed, and his father had farmed, and he had farmed for 27 years. He said, "Thank you, Your Grace." Edmund rode back to the estate with the specific feeling of a man who has done a thing that was right and does not know yet exactly how he knows it was right, only that he does. He thought about what Eleanor had said months ago about her father. The work was the thing, not the credit. He thought she was right, and she was also right, that both things matter. He thought, I want the work and the credit to go to the correct places. He thought, I am going to need a long time to do it properly. He found himself looking forward to the long time in a way he had not looked forward to anything in longer than he could accurately remember. They were married in April. The wedding was at the church in the village below Ashbourne, the church where the Wycliffe family had been married for 3 generations, which was small and old, and had the particular quality of a building that has witnessed a great many promises and has come to regard them with measured patience. The morning was the kind of April morning that Yorkshire produces occasionally in deliberate contrast to its usual temperament, clear and warm, with the quality of light that comes after a long winter and means it. Eleanor wore a dress the color of the morning light. She had chosen it herself from the fabric she had selected herself, made by the seamstress in the village, who had been making gowns for the county's women for 40 years, and who had measured Eleanor twice, and said on the second measurement that it was a pleasure to work for someone who knew exactly what she wanted. Eleanor had known exactly what she wanted. She had stood in the church with the morning light coming through the old windows, and Edmund beside her, and she had said the words that were required, and meant every one of them. And she had thought in the specific clarity of the moment about a woman who had arrived at a large Yorkshire estate in October, with 3 dresses and a professional history, and no expectation of staying. She thought, I did not know this was coming. She thought I was not looking for it. She thought it found me because I was looking at something else. She thought about her father who had spent 30 years doing valuable work without credit, and who had raised her to believe the work was the thing, and who had been right, and also not entirely right, and who was not there to see this, and whose absence was the one thing that was difficult. She thought he would have liked Edmund. He would have said, that is a man who values the right things. She thought, I think he is right. Edmund held her hand with the specific deliberateness of someone who has spent 17 years being careful with what he allowed himself to want, and has decided finally to not be. She held his hand back. The morning light came through the old church windows, and the promises were made, and the spring was outside the door waiting for them. The estate changed gradually. Not all at once. Large things do not change. All at once, Eleanor had learned any more than damaged documents restore themselves all at once. The change was in the accumulation of different decisions made differently over time. The northern section drainage work was completed by midsummer. The crop yields in the affected fields improved in the first season, though not as dramatically as they would in subsequent ones. Good work takes time to show its full effect. The Farming Knowledge Project, which was Eleanor's initiative, and which she had developed with Edmund's full support into a structured collaboration between Ashbourne's tenant farmers and 2 neighboring estates with similar soil challenges, generated its first practical results by autumn. Mr. Hollis's specific rotation method for the clay-heavy fields was by the following year being studied by an agricultural society and attributed to its correct origin. Eleanor made certain of that. She had become through the course of the year the person who made certain that the correct things were attributed to their correct origins. This was, she had decided, one of the most useful things she could do, and she did it systematically and without making a performance of it. The financial situation at Ashbourne was not resolved in a single season. Good management and good decisions, and the cooperative arrangements that Eleanor had proposed, made a difference, but slowly, and without the immediate dramatic improvement that an alliance like the Casworth proposal would have provided. Edmund had known this would be the case. He had made the decision with full understanding of the timeline. He did not regret it. Eleanor, going through the accounts in her second winter at Ashbourne, and showing Edmund the projections, said, "We will be in a comfortable position within 3 years if the northern yields hold." He said, "You have been modeling this." She said, "Since February." She paused. "I wanted to know before we were married that the decision was manageable." He said, "And if it hadn't been," she said, "then I would have found a different solution." She looked at him. "But I knew it would be." He said, "You were that confident." She said, "I was confident in the work, and in you." A pause. "And in myself." He looked at her. He said, "Yes," simply, without qualification. Lord Casworth attended the winter gathering at Ashbourne the following December. This had not been anticipated. The invitation had been extended as a matter of form. Edmund maintained relationships with all the neighboring families, as was appropriate, and the acceptance had arrived on a Thursday morning with Casworth's precise formal handwriting. He came with his wife, who was a quiet woman of 58, with the expression of someone who makes her own observations privately and shares them selectively. She and Eleanor found each other at the edge of the ballroom during the evening and had a conversation that lasted 40 minutes and produced by its end a mutual assessment that was considerably warmer than either of them had expected. Casworth found Edmund near the library door and said, "The estate is doing well." Edmund said, "Yes, better than I expected at this stage." Casworth looked around the room, which was full of people and warmth, and the specific quality of a house that is actually inhabited rather than maintained. He looked at Eleanor, who was across the room talking to Lady Casworth and Mr. Hollis's wife, who had been invited as part of the farming collaboration's social dimension. He said, "She is not what I expected." Edmund said, "No, she isn't what anyone expects." Casworth was quiet for a moment. He said, "My grandfather married a woman from Northumberland. Did you know that?" Edmund said, "I heard something to that effect." Casworth said, "She was the making of the family by all accounts. People thought it was a strange choice for about 10 years, and then they stopped thinking about it because the results were so evident." He paused. "I expect something similar will be said about Ashbourne." Edmund looked at him. Casworth said, "My congratulations, Wycliffe. I believe you made the right choice." He moved back into the gathering. Edmund stood by the library door for a moment. He thought it did not require Lord Casworth's opinion to confirm the rightness of the choice. He thought, but it is not nothing to have the opinion revised in the direction of truth. He found Eleanor at the edge of the room where she had finished her conversation with Lady Casworth and was looking at the gathering with the particular expression she wore when she was observing something she found interesting. He stood beside her. She said, "Lady Casworth told me her husband has been reconsidering his position since February." He said, "Has he?" She said he admires people who know their own minds. She said it is rarer than it should be. He said, "What did you say?" She said, "I said I agreed." He looked at her. She looked at him with the expression that lived beneath everything else, the one she showed when she was not managing anything, when she was simply present and honest and herself. He said, "I want to tell you something." She said, "Yes." He said, "A year ago I was a man who had spent 17 years doing what was required and telling himself it was enough. I was very good at telling myself things were enough." A pause. "I was not in fact living in a way that was enough. I was managing." She was quiet, listening. He said, "You arrived in October, and you asked me a question, and you stayed, and you told me true things, and you found things in the archive that changed what I understood about my own family. And you let me be a person, and not only a duke." He paused. "I want you to know that I understand the difference now, between managing and living, and I intend to live." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You already are." He said, "I know. I wanted to say it anyway." She said, "I know." A pause. "I wanted to hear it anyway." The gathering moved around them, the music and the candlelight, and the county's families, recalibrating, and the winter night pressing at the tall windows, and they stood at the edge of the room together, which was also the center of the room, and the distinction did not matter, because they had both stopped needing to be at the edge. Years later, when people in the county spoke about Ashbourne Estate, they spoke about two things. The first was the Northern Farming Cooperative, which had grown from Eleanor's initial proposal into something considerably larger than any of them had originally envisioned, a network of estates sharing agricultural knowledge and methods with the specific expertise of the tenant farmers, credited and compensated properly, and the resulting improvements in yield documented and published by the Agricultural Society that had 3 years in dedicated an entire volume of case studies to the Ashbourne model. The second was harder to articulate in the way that the most important things often were. People said Ashbourne had changed. Not the building, not the grounds, not the formal elements of the estate's presentation. The change was in the quality of the place, in the way the people who lived and worked there moved through it, in the relationship between the house and the village, and the farming families, in something that felt when you stood at the gates and looked in like an estate that was actually alive rather than simply maintained. They said something happened there several years ago when the Duke made an unexpected choice. They said the woman he chose turned out to be exactly what the estate needed. They were right, and also not entirely right, in the way that county opinions usually were. The truth was more precise. The estate had not needed Eleanor because it had lacked her particular skills, though it had certainly benefited from them. The estate had not been transformed by the cooperative model, or the archive project, or the drainage work. Oh, all of those things were real and lasting contributions. What had happened at Ashbourne was smaller and larger than any of those things. A man had spent 17 years believing that his value was entirely his function, that the estate required everything, and that giving everything was what justified his existence. That loneliness was the appropriate condition of a man who had inherited too much, too young, and could not afford to need anything he could not supply for himself. A woman had spent 6 years believing that her value was entirely her usefulness. That being needed was the closest available substitute for being wanted. That leaving before being required to leave was the only way to maintain the dignity of her situation. That the work was the thing, the credit was not the thing, and the connection was certainly not the thing. They had found each other in October, in a room full of men who expected nothing from either of them, and they had been honest, and they had paid attention, and they had been patient with the damage and open to the structure beneath it. And somewhere in that process, not at any single identifiable moment, but in the accumulation of honest conversations and true things, and the particular quality of being seen by someone who is actually looking, they had both discovered something they had not known was missing. A person who looked at them and found them worth looking at. Not worth managing, not worth using, not worth tolerating in their proper category. Worth knowing. In the spring of their 3rd year at Ashbourne, Eleanor found the last missing piece of her father's connection to the estate. She was in the oldest section of the archive, where she had been cataloging the final boxes that predated even the flooding damage, and she opened a volume that had been filed under estate correspondence from 50 years ago and found tucked inside the back cover a personal letter. The handwriting was her father's. It was addressed to her. She recognized from the date that he had written it a year before his death, when he had still been at Harton, and she had been at her second professional post in a neighboring county. She sat on the floor of the archive with the old letter in her hands, and she read it. He had written, "I know you will make your way. You always have, and you will. But I want to say something I have not said clearly enough, because I have been in the habit of saying the work is the thing, and it is the thing, but it is not the only thing. A life spent doing good work in rooms that do not recognize it is a worthwhile life. But you deserve more than that. You deserve to be in rooms that see you clearly. I hope you find one." She read it 3 times. Then she held it for a long time in the quiet of the old archive, with the spring light coming through the small high window, and the smell of old paper, and the 40 years of careful quiet, uncelebrated history around her. She thought he knew. She thought he wanted this for me. She thought I found it. I found the room. She sat for a while longer. Then she got up, and she put the letter in the preservation envelope she kept in her bag, and she labeled it carefully, the way she labeled everything, and she went to find Edmund. She found him in the library. He looked up when she came in with the full attention. The real thing, always the real thing, always present when she arrived, and she sat down in the chair across from his and held out the envelope. He read the letter. He read it carefully, the way he read everything important. When he looked up, he had the expression he wore when something had reached him at the level where things were not managed. She said, "He knew." He said, "Yes." She said, "He would have. I think he would have been glad." He set the letter down on the table between them gently, the way she would have set down a document that required careful handling. He said, "So am I." She looked at him. She thought, "This is the room." She thought, "I am in it." She thought about a woman who had arrived in October with 3 dresses and a professional history and an absolute commitment to the work being the thing. She thought the work was the thing. She thought this is also the thing. She thought about her father's shelves of files, everything labeled and documented 30 years of good work that had gone unacknowledged. She thought about the archive at Ashbourne rebuilt and ordered, and complete the estate's history now legible to anyone patient enough to look. She thought, "I found the documents." She thought, "I found all of them." Edmund reached across table and took her hand, the way he had in the county magistrate's room, the way he had on that cold February morning, the quiet gesture of a man communicating something for which the words have become unnecessary. She held his hand. The spring light came through the east windows of the library at Ashbourne and fell across the floor between them in the clear, warm way of light that has decided to stay. Outside, the gardens were coming in. The roses in the formal section had come in the previous year for the first time in a decade, replanted by Hargrove's direction and tended by the gardener, whom Eleanor had quietly asked to restore the cutting beds her predecessor had let go. The northern fields were dark with the particular dark of earth that is ready. The village below the gates was going about its mourning. The estate was alive, not because everything had been solved, or because the damage had been entirely repaired, or because the county had revised every opinion, or the financial situation had become comfortable, or the old difficulties had been fully resolved, but because something had been recognized, something that had been valuable all along in the specific way that some things are valuable all along but require someone patient enough to find them, something that does not announce itself, that waits in the misfiled boxes and the covered places in the careful work and the honest rooms in the quality of a person's attention when they look at you and are genuinely trying to see. Edmund Wycliffe had spent 17 years believing his value was entirely his function. Eleanor Whitmore had spent 6 years believing hers was entirely her usefulness. They had been wrong. And on an April morning in their 3rd spring at Ashbourne, in a library that finally had 2 people in it who wanted to be there, they sat together in the clear light and held that knowledge between them like something they had found and intended to keep. There it was. There it had always been.